The young and the restless spoilers shock. The revelations unfolding in Genoa City shine a harsh light on Clare Newman's unwavering commitment to doing everything by the book, even as her grandfather, revered and reviled in equal measure as great Victor Newman, casts aside reason and restraint in pursuit of vendettas that would make a more rational mogul blush. From the moment Clare first stepped onto the Newman ranch, her every move has been governed by a meticulous logic born of years spent observing boardroom theatrics and family power plays. She negotiated sponsorship deals for Newman Enterprises with due diligence, insisted on transparent audits when her father's indulgences threatened to destabilize the company's balance sheet, and counseled her cousin Summer to seek mediation rather than resort to the scorched-earth tactics that have become the Newman hallmark. Where Clare saw risk, she calculated potential rewards. Where Clare saw betrayal, she sought full disclosure and an opportunity for reconciliation. In contrast, Victor's methods have become increasingly divorced from any conventional notion of business acumen or even basic decency. His instinct is to lash out, to exact punishment without regard for collateral damage, and to treat every perceived slight against the Newman name as justification for expensive counterattacks that leave emotional and financial casualties in their wake. He gathers his board at a moment's notice not to chart a coherent strategy but to summon support for ventures driven by personal pique. He turns family funerals into forums for public finger-pointing. He converts investor presentations into moral pronouncements on loyalty and obedience. Under Victor's thumb, Newman Enterprises teeters on the brink of implosion, not because its products or services have faltered, but because its leader has chosen to wage private wars in full view of shareholders, employees, and, increasingly, Clare herself, who watches every one of her grandfather's irrational outbursts with a mixture of horror and determination, resolved that she will salvage what she can of the company he built. No figure looms larger in Victor's gallery of adversaries than Jack Abbott, whose rivalry with Victor is the stuff of Genoa City legend. Their feud did not begin on the battlefield of corporate accounts but in the intimate crucible of shared heartbreak, Jack's marriage to Nikki Newman. Nikki, whose loyalty once seemed as unshakable as Victor's own sense of entitlement, fell for Jack's charm and kindness during a time when Victor's ambition blinded him to the personal cost of his actions. Jack, the pivot around which the Abbott empire has turned for decades, won Nikki's heart and, in doing so, branded Victor the architect of her deepest sorrow when a tragic accident, an unintended consequence of Victor's reckless interference in Nikki's life, led to the loss of her unborn child. From that moment on, every handshake between Victor and Jack was laced with the silent knowledge of betrayal. Every corporate merger discussion was undercut by the possibility of a personal ambush. The animosity became a saga of tit-for-tat maneuvers, Victor undercutting Abbott Enterprises' bids for lucrative contracts, Jack turning hostile takeover attempts into public spectacles. Their rancor, fueled as much by wounded pride as by corporate calculus, turned Genoa City into a chessboard on which family loyalty, personal justice, and cold-blooded strategy collided. Fans who remember the early days recall Brad Carlton standing at Victor's side, believing in the man's vision, only to be betrayed himself when Victor sacrificed personal relationships on the altar of profit. They recall how Jack, once a protégé, transformed into Victor's most formidable opponent not through ambition alone but through a sense of moral outrage that resonated with the city's business community, one that valued honor as much as margin sheets. Into this vortex of familial vendettas and corporate warfare steps Kyle Abbott, Victor's current mandate target and the fresh face of a new generation of Abbotts bent on unseating the Newman legacy. Kyle, raised in the shadow of Victor's empire and Jack's defiance, embodies the worst traits of both dynasties, an entitlement born of wealth and a ruthlessness sharpened in boardroom skirmishes rather than battlefields. Unlike Jack, whose affections for Nikki humanized him in the public's eye, Kyle shows little regard for the personal bonds that once tethered his forebears to their humanity. He negotiates contracts with the air of someone ordering takeout, dismisses long-standing partnerships with a flick of his cufflink, and publicly derides Newman Enterprises' stock performance without ever acknowledging the human cost of his jabs. His modern sophistication. always one step ahead in adopting the latest fintech disruptions or employing aggressive social media campaigns, masks a cynical opportunism. He respects no tradition yet exploits every vulnerability. To Genoa City, he is the new face of corporate arrogance, the brash upstart willing to burn every bridge to make a name for himself, even if that name is Abbott too. And yet, for all his calculated cruelty, Kyle's youthful recklessness belies an insecurity rooted in being the heir of two warring titans. He aspires to vindicate Jack's insurgent spirit but to eclipse Victor's intimidating legacy. He thrives on chaos yet fears being remembered as a footnote in a feud that outlived his mentors. His every move tests the limits of rational strategy, demonstrating that even in an era of data-driven decision-making, the most unpredictable algorithms are those governed by ego and the unquenchable thirst for revenge. Viewed from the vantage point of the real world, none of this should pass muster. No Fortune 500 CEO would allocate billions of dollars in research grants as leverage in a family dispute. No respected board of directors would permit shareholder funds to underwrite personal vendettas. Yet soap opera logic has long defied the boundaries of plausibility, embracing melodrama as its lifeblood. In the blink of an eye, an industry magnate can transform into a jilted lover, a boardroom can morph into a battlefield for honor, a family reunion can erupt in scandalous revelations that reverberate across every storyline. And so, while Clare Newman strains to impose reason, demanding risk assessments, legal reviews, and crisis management protocols, she finds herself increasingly sidelined by Victor's grandstanding and Kyle's relentless scheming. The contrast between Clare's meticulous logic and her grandfather's impetuous theatrics underscores the core paradox of Genoa City, that power without restraint breeds not stability but endless conflict, and that even the most rational mind can be overwhelmed by the raw force of legacy and resentment. As the Newman and Abbott clans brace for yet another showdown, this time with Clare determined to reclaim her heritage through competence and compassion, the city watches in suspended disbelief, captivated by a drama that, for all its implausibility, mirrors the universal truth that when personal pride and family loyalty collide, even the most sensible strategies can be swept away in a tide of emotion. The unfolding saga in Genoa City has never been more vivid than in the aftermath of those catastrophic moments that reshaped the Newman-Abbott feud forever. When young John Abbott III perished, the tragedy did not merely claim an heir, it crystallized a rivalry that had already simmered for decades into full-blown legend. In daytime television lore, no showdown has matched the day Jack Abbott, consumed by grief and fury, drove Victor Newman to the edge of the colonnade. And, in one unforgettable instant, delivered a kick that sent Victor sprawling across marble floors, abandoned to bleed, to suffer, and ultimately to collapse with a heart attack that would echo through every boardroom, every family dinner, and every whispered conversation among Genoa City's elite. That John's demise was the catalyst for such cinematic, and yet deeply human, conflict only underscores the way soap opera logic magnifies every misstep into a seismic event. Where in any rational universe a grieving father and grandfather might have sought solace in private mourning, Victor pounded the conference room table in rage. Where a corporate scion might have deferred revenge to corporate counsel, Jack grabbed Nikki's hand and stormed the Newman mansion, and where a grieving granddaughter like Clare Newman might have expected her family's support, she instead found herself caught between two immovable forces, each convinced that their pain and their rightness justified every collateral casualty. At the heart of this drama stands Clare Newman, whose unshakable devotion to order and propriety has been both her armor and her burden. From the moment she assumed a junior executive role at Newman Enterprises, Clare made it her mission to rationalize every decision. Insisting upon risk assessments for new product lines, convening ethics committees to advise on family-funded philanthropy, and negotiating lease agreements for satellite offices with the same precision one might apply to a merger and acquisition. Yet Clare's devotion to logic offered her no refuge when Victor's wrath turned inward. In the wake of John III's death, Victor refused to permit Clare to relocate temporarily to the Abbott estate for safety and healing. He dismissed her pleas, utterly inconceivable to anyone outside the Newman clan, as a betrayal of family loyalty. "No Abbott is fit to harbor a Newman," he declared, his voice cold with the conviction that any alliance with Jack's progeny would stain the family honor. Thus Clare stood, bereft of her father's arms and her grandfather's blessing, wandering the very hallways she had once patrolled with confidence. Her only sanctuary was the empty executive suite where she once drafted budgets. The wide windows looked out over city streets that suddenly seemed alien, each streetlight a reminder of homes she could no longer reach. Meanwhile, Kyle Abbott, Jack's son and Claire's would-be refuge, became the focal point of Victor's contempt. Kyle's relationship with Clare had blossomed quietly, born of late-night strategy sessions in the Newman boardroom and shared memories of childhood summers on Newport's beaches. He knew Clare as both a principled businesswoman and a wounded granddaughter. She knew him as the heir to an empire perpetually at war with her own. To Kyle, Clare's plight was proof that the old rivalries had to end. If Newman and Abbott scions could find common cause, perhaps Genoa City could escape the pernicious cycles of retribution. Yet Victor would brook no such rapprochement. Over cocktails at the storied GC Sports Club, where the mahogany walls whispered tales of every championship and every betrayal, Victor cornered Billy Abbott, Kyle's cousin and longtime friend. He recounted, in low tones, every slight he believed the Abbott family had inflicted, the time Jack usurped his CEO seat, the rumor that Jack had once colluded with media watchdogs to freeze Newman stock, the whispered insinuations that Jack's takeover bids had endangered Newman pensions. To Billy's dismay, Victor's tale was less an appeal for truce than a manifesto demanding fealty. If any Abbott ventures to claim a Newman woman, he warned gravely, they answer directly to me. And so Billy, torn between loyalty to blood and compassion for Clare, found himself the reluctant messenger of a tyrant's decree. All of which brings us back to that fateful confrontation at the colonnade. Gordon's catering staff still tremble at the memory of Jack's broad-shouldered silhouette looming over Victor, speaking in a voice so cold that his own knees shook. As Victor gasped and clutched his chest, Jack's eyes narrowed not in triumph but in horror, because no mortal blow, however well aimed, could justify letting another human being die. It was Jack's hesitation, an almost imperceptible flicker of remorse, that saved Victor's life in the end. Paramedics arrived. Victor was rushed to Edwards River Valley Medical Center, and as the defibrillator paddles snapped and sizzled, the Titans of Genoa City faced the prospect that their war might claim more victims than either side could bear. Yet, when Victor awoke, the first face he demanded to see was not that of a doctor but that of the man who had come so close to ending him. In that stark hospital room, with bleached walls and the steady beep of monitors, the real battle lines were redrawn. Victor would survive, he vowed, not simply to rebuild his empire, but to reshape it by erasing any hint of weakness he could find, not least in family members who dared to defy him. And so Clare Newman, bereft of her inheritance and her home, faced a crossroads. Kyle's offer to shelter her in the Abbott mansion, a place once so alien that its front gates felt like a barrier rather than a welcome, seemed her only hope. The night she arrived, rain still dripping from her shoulders, she found Kyle in Jack's old study, poring over architectural plans for a shared Newman-Abbott headquarters. He greeted her with a tentative smile, as if afraid that any warmth might provoke Victor's ire. They spoke in whispers of lavish offices and joint charitable funds, of how a new era of cooperation might save both legacies from self-destruction. For a brief moment, Clare allowed herself to hope that love, reason, and shared loss might forge an alliance stronger than any board resolution. But dawn brought a curt text from Victor, gather your things. You're to return home immediately. No exceptions. And with that, the last thread of sanctuary unraveled. The man who had built an empire from ruthlessness demanded obedience from the woman whose only crime had been to insist on reason. What followed was a negotiation for the ages. Clare, insisting upon a legally binding agreement that Victor would refrain from corporate sabotage if she remained with Kyle, Victor, countering with clauses stripped directly from Abbott Enterprises' own hostile takeover documents. Their lawyers danced a macabre waltz in the halls of Newman Enterprises' law library, each clause more barbed than the last. But beyond the ink and the fine print lay the raw emotion that no contract could contain. Claire's empathy for a grandfather whose heart attack revealed a vulnerability he would never admit, Kyle's frustration at watching the woman he loved pitted against her own blood, Billy's helplessness as he realized that peace demanded sacrifices neither family was willing to make. In the midst of these high-stakes negotiations, Genoa City's business community held its breath. If Newman and Abbott could not reconcile, the ripple effects would drown every stockbroker's forecast, every real estate appraisal, every small business bankrolled by the Newman-Abbott Charitable Foundation. And yet, even as the corporate war machine ground inexorably onward, a different kind of battle smoldered beneath the surface, a struggle for the future of an entire clan. Victor's iron-fisted tactics had erected walls around Claire's heart, walls steeped in fear that any act of autonomy might be met with corporate exile. But every wall breeds cracks, and Claire's conviction that no family should be torn apart by ancient feuds grew stronger with each defeat. She began drafting her own vision for Newman Enterprises, a path forward that honored Victor's legacy of innovation while enshrining principles of transparency and empathy. She called it Project Phoenix, an audacious plan to launch a joint venture incubator with Abbott Enterprises, employing young entrepreneurs to reimagine Genoa City's economic future. It was, she knew, a provocation to Victor's pride. But if there was to be any hope of breaking the cycle, she needed to show that reconciliation could yield more than peace, it could yield prosperity. The stage is set for the next act in this long-running drama. Will Victor relent and recognize that his granddaughter's wisdom offers the best hope for preserving all they hold dear? Or will he double down, forcing Claire to choose between blood and principle? Can Kyle transcend the shadow of his forebears and champion a union that promises unity rather than division? And what part will Billy play, mediator, betrayer, or the catalyst for a reconciliation neither family sees coming? Genoa City watches, transfixed, as their modern-day titans wage a war that blends corporate strategy with primal emotion. For in this realm where logic clashes with legacy, and love contends with loyalty, one truth prevails above all. Even in a world built on power and wealth, it is the human heart, fragile, uncalculable, and endlessly resilient, that ultimately holds the key to peace. The pressure bearing down on Claire Newman has reached a fever pitch. In the span of a single week, her world has been reduced to a battlefield of ultimatums and threats that would break the spirit of a far tougher adversary than herself. First came Victor's demand that Billy Abbott divulge every scrap of intelligence he possesses regarding Aristotle Dumas, an enigmatic billionaire whose clandestine investments have begun to encroach on Newman Enterprises' traditional strongholds. In exchange for Victor's solemn promise to refrain from publicly smearing Billy's reputation. The stakes could not have been clearer: betray his own family's confidences or watch his name dragged through the mud at the very moment his personal and professional alliances hung by the thinnest of threads. Billy, torn between loyalty to his blood and self-preservation, found himself forced to weigh the future of his career against the potential ruin of his integrity. Every night, he lay awake imagining the headlines, the whispered rumors among Genoa City's elite cocktail parties, the way his daughters might look at him if his name appeared in the same breath as slanderous allegations. In that terrifying limbo, the gravity of Victor's power was laid bare, not merely a corporate titan, but a patriarch whose reach extended into the deepest fissures of every Abbott and every Newman soul alike. Meanwhile, Adam Newman, whose own complicated history with Victor has been punctuated by betrayals, reconciliations, and betrayals anew, received a chilling warning of his own. Victor had decreed, in no uncertain terms, that Adam was forbidden from selling his penthouse condominium to Claire and Kyle. The legal ownership of that luxurious high-rise retreat had seemed to Claire like a lifeline, a private refuge far from the scheme-laden halls of Newman Enterprises, a place where she and Kyle might regroup and plan a future free from Victor's overbearing presence. Yet Victor, wielding threats like a scalpel, threatened to strip Adam of every Newman asset he holds if he dared to transfer ownership. For Adam, who once thrived under Victor's imposing gaze but had since chafed under that same shadow, the ultimatum reminded him of the cost of defiance: exile, financial ruin, and the erasure of every accomplishment he had ever claimed as his own. The prospect of watching Clare and Kyle claim a foothold in what he still considered a Newman stronghold filled him with a mixture of guilt and defiance. But guilt alone would not save him from Victor's wrath, and defiance alone could not protect Clare from having the last vestiges of her autonomy torn from her grasp. Under the weight of these maneuvers, Clare Newman found herself teetering at the brink. Every channel of potential escape, every alliance she might have forged, every asset she might have leveraged, had been systematically neutralized by her grandfather's intricate network of threats. Her confidence, once unshakable, now trembled under the weight of Victor's relentless onslaught. Yet the crucible of desperation has a strange way of forging new strengths. Rather than crumple beneath the barrage, Clare's resolve began to harden into steel. She started to see that the very tactics meant to break her would instead illuminate a path forward. If Victor believed that constriction would lead her to surrender, he underestimated the fierce independence that had driven Clare's every success. She resolved that, if she could not rely on tradition or legal ownership, she would instead rely on strategy, coalition building, and the unshakable truth that power in Genoa City was as much about perception as it was about title deeds. With each passing hour, her plan to extricate herself from Victor's grip became clearer. She would not simply flee, she would fight back on her own terms, rally unlikely allies, and seize control of her destiny. Enter Jack Abbott, who found himself unwilling to stand idly by while Victor trampled his son's future. When Victor brazenly stormed into the Jabot boardroom, shining his veneer of authority like a gaudy badge of intimidation, threatening Kyle's position and issuing veiled promises that any Abbott who defied him would be written out of Newman Enterprises' favor, Jack could contain his outrage no longer. He rose from his leather chair, tall and unyielding, and confronted Victor in a voice that brooked no equivocation. The confrontation took place amidst the sleek glass and steel architecture of the Abbott headquarters, a space Jack had built to represent transparency and accountability, a deliberate contrast to the shadow-laden boardrooms of Newman Enterprises. "Your interference ends here," Jack declared, his tone measured yet unbreakable. He accused Victor of running his corporation like a mob boss, of wielding reputation and resources as weapons rather than as instruments of genuine leadership. The tension crackled like static in the air, as these two patriarchs, one representing family legacy founded on ruthless ambition, the other embodying an ethos of principled enterprise, stared down across the conference table. Jack's intervention was more than a father defending his child, it was a statement of principle. Having finally extricated himself from Victor's decades-long vendetta? First during the turbulent aftermath of Marco Anicelli's exposure as a fraudster in Jabot's ranks, and again when his own marriage and personal reputation hung in the balance, Jack understood that every business rivalry carries human costs. He could not, in good conscience, allow Victor to wield his influence unchecked. As Jack's voice echoed through the polished boardroom, Victor's steely demeanor flickered, revealing the slightest crack in his facade. For the first time, he hesitated, if only for a heartbeat, and in that heartbeat, Jack seized an opening to drive home a point. There were lines even Victor should not cross. But soap opera logic, as Genoa City residents well know, demands that conflict outlive any momentary ceasefire, and so the air between them remained electrified, the prospect of reconciliation drowned in the unspoken knowledge that neither side would relinquish the fight without exacting its pound of flesh. And so the stage is set for a joint offensive, a calculated reaction born of shared outrage and paternal duty. Kyle, buoyed by his father's defense, began to marshal resources within Jabot to counterattack Newman Enterprises, seeking to strike at Victor's fiscal strongholds in industries where Abbott's technological innovations have recently begun to outpace the Newman's more traditional textile and fragrance businesses. Side by side, Jack and Kyle plotted a campaign of strategic acquisitions and public relations maneuvers intended to force Victor back into a defensive posture. Their plan involved quietly courting key shareholders in Newman Enterprises, those uneasy about Victor's vendetta-driven spending, and unveiling a proposal for a cross-company consortium that, on the surface, promised tremendous synergy but in reality would dilute Victor's unilateral control. It was a masterstroke of corporate theater. Offer the promise of unity while orchestrating a takeover that would leave Victor isolated. At the same time, they engaged sympathetic reporters with insider whispers about Newman Enterprises' internal turmoil, ensuring that Victor's image as the infallible titan would be tarnished just as virulently as he had once defamed his enemies. Yet even the most brilliant strategy risked falling apart if the human drama behind the headlines was ignored. Clare, watching from the margins, felt a mixture of vindication and apprehension. She had never sought to supplant her grandfather outright. Her vision had always been one of reform, tempering his darker impulses with transparency and compassion. Now, however, she faced a choice: align herself fully with the Abbott assault, sacrificing the fragile threads of family loyalty for the sake of her own freedom, or carve out a third path that transcended both camps. It was in this moment of crisis that Clare's ingenuity shone brightest. She drafted a public statement acknowledging Victor's unparalleled achievements and her deep personal love for him, while simultaneously announcing her departure from Newman Enterprises' executive suite to launch a new philanthropic foundation focused on corporate ethics and community development. The timing was impeccable. It framed her decision as an act of principled independence rather than rebellion, placing public pressure on Victor to either allow her autonomy or risk being perceived as the patriarch who punished the good of his own flesh and blood. Victor's counters would come swiftly. He could not abide a public narrative in which Clare was cast as the martyr. He would accuse her of grandstanding, of colluding with Abbott to undermine the Newman legacy, and of betraying the very values he believed he had instilled in her. Legal notices would fly, injunctions to block her use of the Newman name in any corporate venture, demands for restitution of company documents, veiled threats of lawsuits that would drag her into years of litigation. The board of Newman Enterprises itself, long accustomed to Victor's unilateral decrees, would become a battleground as directors took sides, some pleading for a peaceful resolution, others closing ranks around Victor's vision of family-driven enterprise. As the legal and corporate skirmishes intensified, Genoa City's social calendar would fill with rumor-laden galas, charity fundraisers, and under-the-radar investor lunches, each event a pawn in the escalating power play. All of this unfolds against the backdrop of unbreakable human bonds and the ever-present possibility of reconciliation. Jack's defense of Kyle, while undeniably strategic, also reminded him of the principles that once guided his own rise: fairness, loyalty, and respect for individual dignity. Clare's announcement, while crafted as a blow, also carried the seed of hope. That one day, Victor might recognize that empowering his granddaughter and fostering cooperation with the Abbott line could strengthen, rather than diminish, the Newman heritage. And perhaps most importantly, Billy and Adam, each caught in the crossfire of Victor's demands, might rediscover their own moral compasses, choosing solidarity with family over subservience to a patriarch whose methods have grown increasingly destructive. In the crucible of Genoa City, where family ties and corporate empires intertwine like vines around a trellis, conflict is inevitable. Yet within that conflict lies the potential for transformation. Whether through legal maneuvering, public relations gambits, or heartfelt appeals to legacy and love, each player has a chance to redefine what power means in the Newman-Abbott saga. Will Clare's bold stand for independence spark a new era of cooperation, or will Victor's refusal to yield drive the family to irrevocable schism? Can Jack and Kyle's alliance succeed without sacrificing the very values they claim to uphold? And will the ghosts of past tragedies, John Abbott III's fatal accident, Victor's near-fatal collapse, guide them toward mercy, or fuel the flames of vengeance anew? As the final act of this drama unfolds, one truth remains certain. In Genoa City, the only constant is change, and the greatest victories are those won not through domination, but through the resilient triumph of the human spirit over the darkest impulses of power.